Brad thought he was unstoppable. A self-proclaimed prankster with a camera in one hand and an ego bigger than the White House itself, he strutted into the crowd, eyes locked on his next viral stunt. His target? A stone-faced White House honor guard, standing motionless, rifle in hand, a symbol of discipline, power, and unwavering focus. But Brad didn't see tradition. He saw an opportunity. Laughing, taunting, and pushing the limits, he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Because the moment his hand gripped that rifle, the game was over. And what happened next? It shocked everyone. Before we dive in, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. The sun hung high over Washington, D.C., casting a sharp glare on the sea of tourists shuffling toward the White House gates. Among them, Brad strutted forward, phone in hand, streaming his every move to a small but loyal audience of online followers. His sunglasses sat crooked on his face, a cocky smirk pulling at the corner of his lips as he narrated his latest adventure. "All right, guys, we're here. White House, front and center. And you know me, I don't do boring sightseeing." He turned the camera to himself, his voice dripping with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Today's mission, getting one of these guards to break. No way they don't react to me." He flipped the camera back to the grand gated entrance where a uniformed White House honor guard stood, rifle in hand, face locked in a steely expression. The soldier's presence radiated discipline, a stark contrast to the chaos of the bustling crowd around him. Parents wrangled their children, tour guides droned facts, and cameras flashed. But the guard remained completely still. Brad slowed his pace, sizing up his target. The guy looked like a statue, perfectly rigid, his uniform crisp and flawless. There wasn't even a twitch in his jaw. Brad licked his lips, already picturing the headlines. Internet prankster breaks, White House guard, priceless reaction. The video would explode. He nudged his friend Kyle, who was trailing behind him, shaking his head. "Dude, don't do anything stupid," Brad scoffed. "Relax. It's just a joke." Kyle muttered something under his breath but didn't stop. He'd seen this before. Brad lived for attention, for pushing limits, for being that guy. And when he got an idea in his head, there was no talking him down. Brad strolled forward, weaving through the crowd until he was only a few feet from the honor guard. He tilted his head, eyes scanning the rifle slung across the soldier's chest. Sleek, polished, pure ceremony. He doubted the thing was even loaded. The air felt heavier this close. The noise of the crowd faded into a low hum. Brad's heart kicked up, not in fear, but in anticipation. He raised his phone, angling the camera just right. "Okay, guys, time to see what happens when you mess with perfection." A tour guide nearby wrapped up a speech about the guards' unwavering focus, their years of training. A group of elderly tourists listened, nodding respectfully. One woman turned and frowned at Brad, sensing the trouble brewing. "Maybe you shouldn't," she started, but Brad was already moving. With a practiced grin, he waved a hand in front of the guard's face, fingers snapping in exaggerated motions. Nothing, no reaction. The soldier was a rock. Brad grinned wider. "Oh, this guy is good." Kyle shifted nervously, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dude, seriously, don't push it." Brad just laughed, eyes locked onto the guard's unwavering stare. The real show was just getting started. Brad stepped even closer, now just a foot, away from the honor guard. The tension in the air thickened, the crowd subtly shifting, sensing the brewing storm. A few people had already pulled out their phones, watching with cautious amusement. Some thought it was harmless fun. Others, especially the older tourists, looked downright uneasy. But Brad? He was loving every second of it. He leaned in slightly, eyes locked onto the soldier's face. "Hey, buddy," he drawled, his voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "You alive in there?" Silence. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. Brad cupped a hand around his ear, exaggerating the moment for his camera. "Hello? Earth to statue man? You hearing me?" Still nothing. The guard stood firm, his hands gripping the rifle across his chest with mechanical precision. His jaw remained tight, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond Brad, beyond the crowd, beyond the foolishness. Kyle shuffled awkwardly, looking around as if expecting security to step in at any second. "Dude, come on, let's just go." But Brad wasn't done. Not yet. His followers were watching. He had an audience, and there was no way he was walking away empty-handed. He needed a reaction. Something. Anything. He circled the guard like a predator sizing up its prey, arms crossed, eyes gleaming with mischief. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, he lunged forward, pretending the crowd was instant. The honor guard didn't flinch. He didn't move an inch, but the air around him seemed to tighten, as if an invisible line had just been crossed. Brad barked out a laugh, straightening up. "Man, this guy's like a robot. No fear, no flinch. I gotta give you credit, dude. You're committed." He turned back to his phone, grinning. "All right, guys. I think we need to turn up the heat a little bit. What do you say?" Kyle ran a hand down his face. "Brad, stop." Brad ignored him, stepping even closer, so close he could almost feel the rigid stillness radiating from the soldier. His smirk widened, then slowly, deliberately, he lifted his hand and waved it right in front of the guard's eyes. Nothing. He wagged a finger. Still nothing. The crowd had grown eerily quiet. Brad exhaled dramatically, shaking his head. "Wow. Okay, I get it. You're not gonna crack." He turned to his phone camera, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "But you know what? I bet he can move. He just doesn't want to." Kyle's eyes widened. "Brad!" Brad smirked, turning back to the honor guard. His hand drifted downward toward the soldier's rifle. And then, with the reckless confidence of someone who had never faced true consequences, he reached out. The second his fingers brushed the polished surface of the ceremonial weapon, the world seemed to stop. Then it exploded. The moment Brad's fingers touched the rifle, everything happened at once. The honor guard, who had been as still as a statue just seconds before, exploded into motion with terrifying speed. In a single fluid movement, he wrenched the rifle away from Brad's grasp, twisting his body with the precision of a machine. Brad barely had time to process what was happening before the butt of the rifle came down in a sharp, controlled motion, not as an attack, but as a warning, stopping just inches from his chest. The sheer force of it sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system, his instincts screaming at him to back off, but it was too late. Before he could react, the guard's boot swept forward, knocking Brad's feet out from under him with brutal efficiency. His body slammed into the pavement with a sickening thud, the wind rushing out of his lungs in a choked gasp. The crowd erupted. Some people gasped. Others outright cheered. Phones were raised, cameras flashing. In mere seconds, Brad had gone from cocky prankster to a crumpled heap on the White House grounds. A sharp pain radiated from his hip where he had hit the pavement. He wheezed, trying to catch his breath, his brain scrambling to understand what had just happened. 1 second, he had been in control, the star of his own show. The next, he was nothing, just another idiot who had pushed too far. Kyle's voice cut through the chaos. "Oh my God, dude." Brad tried to scramble up, but before he could, a weight pressed down on his shoulder. Not hard, just firm enough to let him know he wasn't getting up unless they let him. The honor guard had already reset his stance, rifle back in position, posture perfectly rigid, as if nothing had happened. But now his presence was suffocating. There was no more ignoring him, no more treating him like a prop in a joke. For the first time in his life, Brad felt small. Heavy footsteps thundered toward him. 2 uniformed Secret Service agents descended. On him, their faces unreadable, their movements efficient and final. One of them grabbed him by the arm, yanking him upright with ease. His legs wobbled beneath him, his body still reeling from the takedown. "Sir," one of the agents said, his voice as cold and professional as the guard's stance, "you're coming with us." Brad's mouth opened, but no words came out. He had nothing to say, no excuse, no witty comeback, just silence. The agent didn't wait for a response. With a firm grip, they began dragging him away. The last thing Brad saw before he was pulled through the crowd was the honor guard, standing tall, rifle in hand, completely unfazed, as if none of it had ever happened. The world around Brad blurred. As the Secret Service agents dragged him away from the White House gates, His legs stumbled beneath him, his mind still spinning from the takedown. The laughter, the gasps, the clicking of cameras, it all blended into a chaotic mess of sound. He could feel dozens of eyes drilling into him, watching his humiliation unfold in real time. The same people who had chuckled at his antics minutes earlier were now staring at him with either disgust or outright amusement. Someone in the crowd shouted, "That was the dumbest thing I've ever seen." Another voice, this one younger, yelled, "Bro got folded like a lawn chair." Heat crawled up Brad's neck. The confidence that had fueled him moments before was gone, leaving behind a hollow pit of dread in his stomach. This wasn't just a prank gone wrong. To argue, to say something that would make all of this not as bad as it looked, but before he could get a word out, one of the agents tightened their grip on his arm. "Keep moving," the agent ordered, his voice devoid of emotion. Brad swallowed hard and shut up. Kyle trailed behind them, looking equal parts horrified and embarrassed. His hands were shoved into his pockets, his head down, as if hoping no one would connect him to this disaster. Can I just say," Kyle started, but one of the agents cut him off with a sharp glance. "You can leave," Kyle blinked. "Wait, what? You're not under arrest." "Your friend, however," the agent yanked Brad forward, "just interfered with federal security." Kyle took a step back, as if finally realizing just how serious this was. He hesitated for a moment, looking at Brad like he wanted to say something, maybe apologize, maybe tell him he was an idiot. Instead, he just sighed and muttered, "You're on your own, dude." Then he was gone, lost in the crowd. Brad barely had time to process the betrayal before he was pulled through a side entrance near the White House, away from the tourists, away from any escape. His heart pounded against his ribs. This wasn't some mall cop situation. This was federal law enforcement. Finally, they stopped. One of the agents turned him toward a wall and pressed him against it, frisking him with cold efficiency. "Any weapons?" Brad stammered. "No!" "Dude, it was just a joke." Neither of them reacted. No emotion, no acknowledgement, just two professionals doing their job. A door swung open, and Brad was pushed inside a small, windowless room. A metal chair, a plain table, a security camera in the corner blinking red. The door clicked shut behind him. For the first time, Brad truly understood. He wasn't walking away from this. Brad sat stiffly in the metal chair, his back pressed against the cold steel frame. The room was small, almost suffocating, with blank white walls and a single overhead light that buzzed faintly. His hands rested on the table, fingers tapping anxiously against the surface, though he wasn't sure why, maybe to convince himself. He was still in control, but he wasn't. His throat was dry, his pulse a hammer against his ribs. He had been in trouble before, detentions, minor fines, getting kicked out of places for his pranks. But this was different. There were no mall cops, no irritated store managers. This was the federal government. The security camera in the corner blinked red, watching his every move. The door creaked open. Two men walked in, both dressed in sharp suits, their expressions carved from stone. One carried a folder, the other had a tablet in his hand. They moved with purpose, the kind that made Brad shrink into his seat despite himself. One of them sat across from him, flipping open the folder. The other remained standing, arms crossed. "Bradley Carter," the seated agent said, his voice as level as a machine. 24 years old, online content creator. He glanced up, his gaze unreadable. Otherwise known as Brad the Prank King. Brad swallowed. The name sounded stupid now. The agent tapped the folder. "Do you have any idea the seriousness of what you just did?" Brad forced a nervous chuckle, trying to mask the unease slithering through him. "Look, man, it was just a joke." The standing agent cut him off. "You put your hands on a member of the United States Armed Forces while he was on duty. That's not a joke." Brad opened his mouth, but no words came out. The seated agent leaned forward slightly, placing his hands on the table. "The honor guard is not a mall security officer. He is not an actor in a theme park. He's a soldier serving in a high security zone. That rifle he carries, it's not a prop, it's a functioning weapon. And you physically interfered with him." Brad's stomach twisted. I didn't think." "No, you didn't." Silence. filled the room like a dense fog. Brad's mind raced. Could they actually arrest him? Charge him? How bad was this going to get? The agent flipped a page in the folder. You have a history of disruptive behavior, several trespassing warnings, a few citations for public disturbances, and now this. Brad's tongue felt like sandpaper. The standing agent finally spoke again, his voice edged with something close to finality. You are looking at charges of unlawful conduct on federal property, interfering with a service member in the execution of their duties, possibly even assault. Brad's stomach dropped. The seated agent leaned back. So, let's try this. Again, he met Brad's wide-eyed stare with an unwavering gaze. Do you have any idea the seriousness of what you just... His usual bravado, the cocky confidence that fueled his online antics, had completely evaporated. He was staring down two federal agents, and they weren't playing along like his usual prank victims. There were no eye rolls, no irritated sighs, no get-out-of-here-kid responses. Just cold, serious consequences. He shifted in his seat, suddenly hyper-aware of how small the interrogation room felt. Look, he started, trying to keep his voice steady. I didn't mean to cause any real trouble. I swear, I thought... The standing agent cut him off. You thought? Brad hesitated. He knew anything he said could be used against him, but the silence was unbearable. I thought it would be funny, he admitted, his voice quieter than before. The agent sitting across from him didn't react. No sigh, no shake of the head, just the same unreadable stare. He tapped the folder again. Let's be very clear, Mr. Carter, what you did wasn't funny. It was reckless. You approached an active duty service member in a high-security area. You ignored verbal and implied warnings, and then you put your hands on a ceremonial rifle. Brad opened his mouth, but the agent wasn't finished. You may not realize it, but you created a security threat today. The honor guard is trained to respond with force when necessary. Had the situation escalated, had you tried to pull that rifle harder, had he deemed you an immediate threat, he let the words hang in the air for a moment before finishing, you wouldn't be sitting here right now. A chill ran through Brad's body. The weight of what the agent was saying finally sank in. This wasn't some harmless prank gone wrong. He had stepped into a world where people didn't play games. The standing agent took a step forward, crossing his arms. Do you know how many people have been arrested for stunts like this? How many have been permanently banned from federal landmarks? You're not special, Brad. You're just another idiot who thought he could test the limits. Brad clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this. Like he was nothing. Like he wasn't in control of his own narrative. But what could he say? He had been an idiot. The seated agent leaned back, exhaling through his nose. We have enough to charge you with multiple offenses. You could be facing federal trespassing charges, disorderly conduct, even obstruction of a government operation. You'd be looking at hefty fines and possibly jail time. Brad's eyes widened. Jail? The agent didn't blink. Jail? Brad's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He was so used to getting away with things, skating by on warnings and slaps on the wrist. This time was different. This time, he wasn't getting away with anything. Brad's breathing grew shallow. His mind raced, flipping through every possible way out of this, but none of his usual escape routes were there. He wasn't dealing with an angry mall cop or a manager who just wanted him to leave. This was real, and the weight of it pressed down on his chest like a boulder. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. Okay. Look, I get it, and I screwed up, but jail. Come on, man, it was a mistake. I wasn't trying to... The seated agent leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. You weren't trying to do what, Brad? Brad's mouth opened, but nothing came out. What could he say? That he wasn't trying to grab a soldier's rifle? That he wasn't trying to cause a security incident at the White House? That he was just an idiot looking for views? The standing agent crossed his arms. Let me guess, you were just joking. Brad flinched at the sharpness in his tone. I mean, yeah, that's what I do. Pranks, online videos, I push boundaries, get reactions, that's what people like. The seated agent didn't react. He just studied Brad for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he tapped the folder in front of him. You know who doesn't like it? the federal government, security personnel, law enforcement. And the public, from the looks of it. Brad blinked. What? The agent turned the tablet toward him. On the screen was a live feed of social media. His stunt had already blown up, but not in the way he'd hoped. White House prank gone wrong. Tourist gets taken down by honor guard. Some idiot messed with the wrong soldier. Instant karma, watch this fool get humiliated at the White House. Thousands of comments flooded the screen, roasting him, mocking him, tearing him apart. Brad's stomach twisted. This was supposed to be his big viral moment. He was supposed to be the guy who broke the unbreakable, not the joke of the internet. He felt his fingers tighten against the table. The seated agent cut him off. Actions have consequences, Mr. Carter. You live by online reactions? Well, his usual confidence shattered. The reality of it hit harder than the pavement he'd been slammed into. He wasn't trending for being funny. He wasn't the center of some new rebellious movement. He was the punchline, the standing. Agent finally spoke again, his voice quieter but no less sharp. Now let's talk about what happens next. Brad barely managed to nod, his throat too dry to speak. The seated agent closed the folder. You're looking at legal repercussions. The only question is, how severe do you want them to be? Brad sat frozen, trapped in a situation that for once he couldn't prank his way out of. Brad sat stiffly in the chair, his fingers twitching against his knee. His mind was still stuck on the screen. The endless flood of comments, the memes being made at his expense, the sheer mockery of it all. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a catastrophe. He wasn't going viral in the way he wanted. He wasn't the rebellious prankster, the guy who pulled off an untouchable stunt. He was a joke, and worse, he was about to face real-life consequences. For it, the seated agent tapped his fingers against the folder. Now listen carefully, Mr. Carter. You are in serious legal trouble. Interfering with federal security personnel is no small matter. You've caused a disruption, ignored clear regulations, and physically touched an active duty guard's weapon. Brad's throat was dry. I get that now. The standing agent gave him a pointed look. Do you? Brad opened his mouth. To argue, to insist that he hadn't meant any real harm, but he stopped himself. They didn't care about excuses. These weren't YouTube moderators flagging his videos. They weren't angry store employees calling mall security. These were government officials, and they weren't playing around. The seated agent continued. Here's what's going to happen. You are currently detained while we assess the charges against you. Trespassing on federal property, disorderly conduct, interfering with government operations. He paused, letting the weight of each charge settle. Right now, we have two options. Brad felt his heart hammering. Oh, options! The standing agent crossed his arms. Option 1, we charge you formally. You'll be arrested, booked, and processed. You'll go through the full legal system, and trust me, a federal charge on your record is not something you want to deal with. That means fines, possible jail time, and the kind of background check that kills careers before they start. Brad's breath caught. Jail. Actual jail. He couldn't even wrap his head around it. The seated agent continued. Option 2, we let you go, but it won't be for free. Brad perked up slightly, hope flickering in his chest. Okay, I'll take option 2. Whatever it is, the agent raised a hand, cutting him off. You don't even know the conditions yet. Brad shut his mouth, nodding quickly. The agent laid it out. 1, you will be permanently banned from all White House and government properties open to the public. You will never set foot near this building again. 2, you will publicly acknowledge your actions and take responsibility. That means issuing a formal apology, not just to us, but to your audience. Brad hesitated at that last part. Like on camera, the standing agent's expression was ice cold, like in a statement. You publicly disrespected a service member, so you'll publicly own up to it. Brad swallowed hard. The weight of it settled over him. No escape, no loophole. Just cold, hard consequences. Brad slumped back in his chair, his stomach twisting into knots. He had expected some kind of punishment, maybe a fine, maybe a temporary ban. But this was public humiliation. His whole brand was built on being untouchable, on pushing boundaries and getting away with it. He wasn't supposed to apologize. He wasn't supposed to admit he was wrong. That wasn't what his followers wanted. But what choice did he have? He could already imagine the headlines. If he refused, YouTuber arrested. After White House stunt, internet prankster faces jail time. His career wouldn't just take a hit, it would be obliterated. No one would work with him, no sponsors, no brand deals, just a criminal record and a lifetime of regret. The seated agent was still watching him, waiting for a response. "What's it going to be, Mr. Carter?" Brad exhaled slowly. "Fine, I'll do the apology." The agent nodded. "Good, but let me be clear. You're not making some half-hearted, 'I'm sorry if you were offended' statement. You're going to own what you did. You're going to acknowledge the disrespect, the security risk, and the consequences, and you're going to do it sincerely." Brad clenched his jaw. Yeah, I get it." The standing agent pulled out a tablet and slid it across the table. "We've already drafted a statement." Picking up the tablet, the screen glowed with a long, carefully worded apology. His name, his actions, the disrespect toward the honor guard, it was all there. No dodging, no spinning it into a joke, just accountability. He skimmed through it, his face heating up. This wasn't just an apology, it was an admission of total defeat. His fans would never let him live this down. But if it meant avoiding jail, he swallowed his pride and nodded. "Fine, I'll say it." The seated agent nodded toward the door. "Let's go then." Brad hesitated. "Wait, you mean right now?" The standing agent didn't blink. "Yes, right now." Brad felt like the walls were closing in. He thought they'd let him issue a statement online where he could control the narrative, but this was worse. They led him out of the interrogation room, down a narrow hallway and into another, slightly larger office. A camera was already set up, a plain government backdrop behind it. No fancy editing, no filters, no jump cuts, just him and the truth. The agent gestured to a chair in front of the camera. "Sit." Brad's legs felt like lead as he walked forward. He sank into the chair, gripping the tablet in his hands. The camera light turned red. The seated agent folded his arms. "Go ahead, Mr. Carter. Start reading." Brad stared at the screen, his mouth dry. His entire online persona was about to be destroyed in real time, and there was nothing he could do about it. Brad's fingers tightened around the tablet as the camera's red recording light stared him down like an unblinking eye. His throat was dry, his palms sweaty. He had faced down angry store owners, mall security, even the occasional police officer, but nothing compared to this. He inhaled sharply and looked at the screen. The words were right there in front of him, carefully crafted, deliberate, undeniable. There was no twisting them, no turning them into a joke. This was an admission of guilt. His lips parted, but for a second, nothing came out. His mind screamed at him to find a way out, to spin this, to save face. Maybe he could say the agents forced him to do it. Maybe he could play it off later, tell his followers it was all staged. But deep down, Brad knew better. This wasn't staged. This wasn't a prank gone wrong. This was real life. And he had screwed up in a way he couldn't laugh off. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "My name is Bradley Carter, and I want to take full responsibility for my actions at the White House." He forced himself to keep going, reading from the tablet as his stomach twisted into knots. "I understand that my behavior was completely inappropriate and disrespectful. The honor guard represents discipline, commitment, and service to this country, and I showed none of those qualities today." The words felt heavy on his tongue, like swallowing wet cement. He exhaled shakily and continued. "My actions were not a joke. They created a security risk and disrespected the men and women who dedicate their lives to protecting this nation. I regret my behavior, and I sincerely apologize to the honor guard, to law enforcement, and to the public for my thoughtless actions." His voice wavered slightly as he reached the last line. "I take full responsibility, and I will accept any consequences that come from my actions." The moment the last word left his lips, the standing agent clicked off the camera. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Brad sat frozen, the reality of what he had just done settling in. That footage would be everywhere soon, on news outlets, social media, reaction videos. He had just gone from the prank king to a public spectacle in the worst possible way. The seated agent took the tablet from his hands. "It'll be released within the hour," Brad blinked. "That's it?" The standing agent crossed his arms. "That's it. You're free to go." For a moment, he didn't move. It felt wrong, like there should be some dramatic punishment, something bigger. But as he looked at the agents, at the stone-cold indifference on their faces, he realized the truth. They didn't care about ruining him. They didn't have to. He had done that to himself. Brad stepped out of the building into the afternoon light, blinking against the brightness. The fresh air should have felt like freedom, but it didn't. Instead, it felt like exile. His legs felt weak as he walked away from the security checkpoint where a couple of agents still stood, watching him until he was clear of the premises. They weren't worried about him anymore. He wasn't a threat. He was nothing to them. Kyle was waiting a few yards away, hands in his pockets, looking anywhere but at him. Brad exhaled sharply. "You seriously just left me in there?" Kyle gave a half-hearted shrug. "Dude, what was I supposed to do? Get arrested with you?" Brad clenched his jaw. He wanted to yell, to throw the blame onto someone else, but deep down, he knew it was pointless. Kyle had tried to warn him. Everyone had, instinctively, his hands still trembling slightly. The first thing he saw was his own face, plastered across dozens of different YouTube thumbnails. The takedown, the interrogation, and now his apology video had already been uploaded. His stomach twisted as he clicked on it. The title was brutal: Bradley Carter's White House Stunt, Official Apology. He didn't even press play. He couldn't. The comment section was already flooded. "This is the most pathetic thing I've ever seen." "Not so cocky now, huh? Bro went from prank king to government's newest toy real quick." Dude had to beg. Not to get arrested, LMAO. His grip tightened around the phone. For years, he had thrived on online attention. Good or bad, it didn't matter. It meant people were watching. But this wasn't controversy. This wasn't edgy content that got people talking. This was humiliation, and there was no coming back from it. Kyle peeked at his screen and let out a low whistle. "Damn, man, this is bad." Brad shot him a glare. "Thanks, genius." "Like I didn't." "Oh, notice," Kyle shrugged. "I mean, maybe lay low for a bit, let people forget." Brad scoffed. Forget? That was the problem. The internet never forgot. This video, this moment, it was forever. His hands shook as he shoved his phone back into his pocket. He could already see the future. Sponsors dropping him, his followers turning against him. People bringing this up every single time he tried to make content again. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. The honor guard was still, standing at his post in the distance, as motionless as before. As if Brad had never even existed, a fresh wave of shame washed over him. Without another word, Brad turned and walked away, feeling the weight of his own irrelevance for the very first time. Brad sat in his dimly lit apartment, the only glow coming from his laptop screen. His room, once filled with cameras, lighting rigs, and stacks of half-opened packages from sponsors, felt emptier than ever. The air was thick with silence. No ringing notifications, no eager messages from fans, no emails from brands wanting collaborations. The numbers on his social media were plummeting. Every refresh showed more unfollows, more angry comments. His last few videos, once guaranteed to rack up views, were now flooded with mockery and disgust. This guy thought he could mess with the White House and get away with it? Unsubscribed? You're not funny, just desperate. Mao. Enjoy being a meme for the wrong reasons, bro. Brad leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Just days ago, he had been planning his next big viral hit. Now, he wasn't sure he even had a future. His biggest stunt had become his biggest failure. He rubbed his temples. Maybe Kyle was right. Maybe he just needed to lay low. Stop posting for a while. Let the internet move on to the next controversy. But deep down, Brad knew the truth. This wasn't something people would forget. This wasn't just another stunt. Gone too far. He had become the face of instant karma, a living, breathing example of what happened when you let arrogance outweigh common sense. He reached for his phone, staring at the notifications piling up. News articles, reaction videos, breakdowns of the incident, all tearing him apart. And then, at the very top of his feed, one final blow. A new meme. His face frozen, mid-fall, arms flailing, the honor guard still standing tall behind him. Caption, "Some souvenirs last forever." The post had millions of likes. Brad let out a hollow laugh, but there was no humor in it, just exhaustion, just defeat. He pushed his chair back and stood up, pacing the room. He had always thought he was untouchable, that he could push the limits, and always come out on top. But the reality had finally hit him harder than that pavement ever did. He walked over to his shelf, past the rows of merchandise with his old catchphrases printed on them, past the expensive cameras and unopened fan mail, past the ridiculous memorabilia he had collected from past stunts. At the very end of the shelf sat a small souvenir he had picked up on the way home, a simple coffee mug with the words, "White." The house visitor printed on the side. Brad picked it up, turning it over in his hands. With a tired sigh, he muttered, "Should have just bought the damn mug and left." For the first time in years, he didn't feel like filming. He placed the mug back on the shelf, turned off his camera, and sat in the silence, realizing he had finally gone too far.